أهلا وسهلا فيكم يا أعزائي المشاهدين ببرنامج it-Tafsir أخبار فلسطين أخبار لكل العالم. Today we're going to talk about COVID-19 in Palestine, specifically how it has affected Palestinian workers. In a new report by Shabaka, the Palestinian policy think tank, analyst Ihab Maherme illustrates how the occupation regime and Israeli capitalists have used the ongoing crisis to further exploit and abuse Palestinians with impunity. Here's how they do it. Let's start with a little bit of background. Although Palestinian workers from all parts of Palestine are oppressed by the racist policies of the Zionist entity, today we're going to focus on workers from the West Bank, where Palestinians live under direct military occupation, fenced in by the apartheid wall. Since the West Bank is not directly a part of the Israeli state, Palestinians from these areas have no citizenship or legal right to enter Israeli territories, whether it be the 1948 Palestine territories or even the illegal Zionist settlements in the West Bank itself. But while the Palestinian population in the West Bank and Gaza has grown to 5.1 million in 2020, about half of whom are working age, the occupation regime has deliberately stifled the Palestinian economy from expanding and thereby generating opportunities to absorb its growing workforce. Consider the fact that the Israeli state manages all land, sea, and air crossings into Palestine, monitoring all transactions and collecting all tariff revenues from the exchange of goods and services, which constitute about 60% of the Palestinian Authority's total revenue. By collecting this money on the PA's behalf, the Israeli state uses the Palestinian economy to influence and control the PA. Additionally, by building settlements and military checkpoints throughout the West Bank, the occupation regime restricts freedom of movement and by extension the exchange of goods and services even between Palestinian cities and villages themselves. Meanwhile, by confiscating land and resources, the Israeli state has completely drained the Palestinian agricultural sector, a major source of employment and income for Palestinians before the Oslo Accords. As Zionist settlers burn Palestinian olive trees, the occupation regime blocks Palestinians from accessing their own agricultural lands and from extracting resources like groundwater, which the Israeli state extracts to sell back to Palestinians. Unsurprisingly, many Palestinians obtain work permits to access jobs within the Israeli economy, as the average daily wage for these workers is more than twice that of their counterparts in the West Bank and more than 4 times higher than in Gaza. Every year, a growing percentage of Palestinians works within Israeli territories directly under Israeli bosses, up to 13.2% in 2019. In fact, Palestinians today are a major workforce within the Israeli construction, industrial, and agricultural sectors. Israeli capitalists are all too happy to use this cheap labor with absolutely no accountability, just as American capitalists have free rein to brutally exploit undocumented lives in the United States. While you would think that over-reliance on Palestinians would be a bad look for the Zionist narrative, the Israeli state, just like the United States, has built its wealth on the theft of land and labor from the very start, but more on that at another time. Although the ability to work within the Israeli economy has allowed Palestinians to find job opportunities, earn higher incomes, and improve their economic conditions, this is only because the occupation regime has actively smothered the Palestinian economy, annexing its industries and resources. Now, the nearly $3.3 billion in annual remittances from workers in Israeli territories have become crucial to maintaining the Palestinian economy afloat. Naturally, this only further subordinates the Palestinian economy to the Israeli state, so that any changes to Israeli policy will directly affect hundreds of thousands of Palestinian families. Already before the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, Palestinian workers frequently reported violations of Israeli labor laws and international treaties, especially with regard to wages, working hours, and leave policies. In 2020, Israeli bosses only further lowered wages, laid off 34,000 Palestinians, and refused to compensate those who followed public health ordinances by staying at home. Altogether, these developments account for 1/3 of the Palestinian economy's losses in 2020, $2.5 billion. Now, the disastrous effects of the Israeli state's economic annexation of the West Bank have only become more evident. After the Palestinian economy shrunk by 11.5% last year, it has no ability left to accommodate workers affected by the pandemic, and the unemployment rate in the West Bank and Gaza is expected to rise to over 30% by the end of this year. And as the economy continues to shrink, its dependence on the Israeli economy is only deepening further. By transforming West Bank communities into economically drained holding pens from which Palestinians can't leave without a work permit, the occupation regime has deliberately proletarianized Palestinians, literally barring them from developing their own industries to drive them to wage labor within the Israeli economy, where they're completely vulnerable to exploitation. On account of the logistical difficulties introduced by the apartheid wall, Palestinian workers must often stay overnight in Israeli territories. Since arranging their own stay in these areas would be extremely difficult, they usually have to stay in accommodations arranged by their Israeli bosses. Packed in extremely precarious conditions that fail to meet even the most basic standards of safety and sanitation, workers are held in large groups at construction sites, factory floors, and warehouses, sleeping without bedding, access to hygiene supplies, or even guaranteed food or drink. The COVID-19 situation has allowed Israeli bosses to control their workers even further. In March 2020, Israeli Security Minister and now Prime Minister Naftali Bennett announced that Palestinian workers can only enter Israeli territories if they coordinate their stay with Israeli bosses and don't return to the West Bank during that time. By making it mandatory for them to stay in these accommodations, Bennett's policy literally puts Palestinian workers in the custody of Israeli bosses who are eager to violate their few remaining rights. While holding Palestinian workers in captivity, Israeli bosses have failed to apply any health and safety measures to mitigate the spread of infection in their already unsanitary workplaces and accommodations. Meanwhile, instead of providing medical tests, workers suspected of being sick are expelled from Israeli territories and dumped at military checkpoints, or even on the side of the road. Unsurprisingly, the first Palestinian victim of the coronavirus was a woman near Jerusalem who got the disease from her son, a worker in the Atarot industrial park. Akin to the treatment of so-called essential workers in the United States, Naftali Bennett has deliberately put Palestinian lives on the front lines to sustain the Israeli economy. Additionally, by blocking Palestinians from free access to their workplaces, the occupation infrastructure of checkpoints, roadblocks, trenches, and iron gates has allowed the entire coterie of Israeli grifters to exploit Palestinian workers, who are often pressured to cooperate with the Israeli intelligence services in exchange for work permits. When their applications are denied, intermediaries try to charge them over $500 a month to get work permits under the table. Meanwhile, the armed thugs who operate the occupation infrastructure routinely abuse Palestinians on their way to work. In just one of many documented cases from last year, Israeli soldiers beat, insulted, and robbed Palestinian workers at gunpoint as they crossed military checkpoints to reach their workplaces in the southern West Bank. Knowing that many Palestinians are desperate to work, Israeli bosses routinely employ workers even without permits, jeopardizing their lives. After all, Israeli soldiers have total leave to chase down and fire tear gas at workers secretly crossing the apartheid wall to feed their families. As always, when the boss takes a risk, workers pay the price, often with their lives. Just in January and February of this year, Israeli soldiers murdered 2 Palestinians on their way to work. Meanwhile, the Israeli state has mobilized its surveillance technologies to tighten its control of Palestinians during the coronavirus crisis, namely through the e-government application Al-Munasik, developed by the Israeli Ministry of Defense. Although the app is supposedly meant to eliminate the need for Palestinians to wait in government offices, these offices were shut down in early 2020, and instead Palestinians were required to download the app, whether to apply for work permits or to use them at checkpoints. Yet in order to use Al-Munasik, users must explicitly agree to terms that allow the Israeli authorities to retrieve and use information and personal data from their cell phones, including device location, incoming and outgoing calls, photos, videos, text messages, and email. Information that is then used to further blackmail and persecute Palestinians. Forcing Palestinians to download literal spyware to apply for work permits marks an unprecedented phase in the history of Israeli extortion of Palestinians, wherein these violations are perpetrated under the legal cover of the Terms of Service Agreement of all things. Within the Israeli economy of death, all the strategies of the Zionist entity synergize very deliberately to monitor Palestinians and create a system wherein cruelty against them are structural features of the regime itself. At the start of the pandemic, when the rate of infection in Israeli territories was significantly higher than in the West Bank, Palestinian workers were instructed to self-isolate, yet Israeli bosses refused to compensate those who did. Since these workers could hardly find alternative jobs in the West Bank, most of them returned to these dangerous areas as soon as they could. Only after years of intentionally thwarting efforts to build their own economy could the Zionists figuratively and literally hold Palestinians at gunpoint as they head back to their squalid labor camps, exposing themselves to the coronavirus while erecting the very infrastructure used to oppress them. And that's exactly why it's not enough for the Israeli state to simply create safe and dignifying working conditions for Palestinians. The heart of the matter is that by occupying the territory and annexing the Palestinian economy, the Zionists have turned Palestinians into a captive proletariat that they can exploit with impunity, a font of cheap labor from which they can continually extract profit. Given the mutually reinforcing synergy between the occupation regime and the capitalist mode of production, the only serious solution to this crisis is not labor reform, but the total overthrow of the Zionist entity. شكراً وبشوفكم المرة الجاية.